but you are a member of society. And as a member of society, reaping all the benefits of being a member of society, you have a responsibility to society. And I think each of us, particularly in the context of a pandemic that's killing millions of people, you have got to look at it and say there comes a time when you do have to give up what you consider your individual right of making your own decision for the greater good of society.
What we're currently witnessing all around us is something unique and without historical precedent, as any student of history or human nature can attest. There have been countless power grabs and attempts at consolidation of power and control across vast empires, from the Egyptians or Hittites or Assyrians to the Persians, Greeks, Macedonians, or Romans. And, of course, there have been innumerable conspiracies with varying degrees of secrecy or transparency between the leading forces behind these power grabs. This is a tale as old as time, and so in this narrow sense, there's nothing new here. What makes our situation unique, and what makes this moment in history so unique, is that aggressive attempts are now being made across the world to develop a global framework of control, an international empire, with immense power to punish or incentivize, threaten or cajole every nation, institution, or individual to ultimately act in accordance with its aims and desires. Of course, this empire swiftly taking shape doesn't announce itself as such, but instead masquerades as numerous organizations and institutions that might appear unconnected, even with grassroots organic origins to the untrained eye. But anyone that takes a moment to follow the money and trace the connections of the individuals involved will quickly find that they're anything but. Quickly find that the leading figures behind the creation and management of these supposedly diverse NGOs or COVID or climate or social justice related organizations, almost without any exceptions, share very specific ideologies and goals. They are not the least bit representative of the public at large, but instead, as if by magic or incredible coincidence, all march to the beat of the same drum. And this drumbeat just so happens to be the same preferred by our largest and most powerful multinationals, and our Goldman Sachs or BlackRock. Most of you with some understanding of history would probably agree with the logic behind that old cliche of absolute power corrupts absolutely. But so often when we consider such statements, as if in accord with some Pavlovian conditioning, many of our minds immediately turn to the famous dictatorial strongmen throughout history, who we've been taught were the epitome of this concept in action. I think this is a mistake. Monarchs or kings or Führers or dictators certainly face the strongest temptations in these regards, and often are deeply corrupted as a result, there's no doubt. But at the very least, there's some element of personal responsibility involved. At least in the sense that if a nation were to be turned upside down and the lives of its citizens made fundamentally and obviously worse during the reign of this or that powerful figure, the leader in question is clearly the responsible party. Of course, there's usually some propaganda involved attempting to massage and condition the public sentiment, perhaps to take less credit for the failures and more credit for the successes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this strongman at the helm is where the buck stops, and all recognize this. And there's something redeeming here, something straightforward and transparent. And I say this to make this point. We've been taught strong men with absolute power are a tremendous threat. But I'd argue, and I think this point is very important, that weak men with absolute power are vastly more so. Specifically, that brand of mediocre men who always operate behind and within committees, institutions, boards of directors, any framework that allows individuals to make tremendously weighty decisions without the full force of responsibility for these decisions falling squarely on their own heads as a result. This allows them to do what weak men do, what weak men have always done, namely pass the buck, absolve themselves of personal responsibility when called out by an angry public. It's an efficient system of blame sharing or responsibility distribution, allowing for the greatest injustices and instances of overreach, because a justifiably furious public is never able to point the finger in any one direction. Instead of being able to point to a single leading figure and say, "This was your decision, own up to it," we now have long chains of spineless administrative class careerists who can each point to the man above or across from them, or to that vague and amorphous new conceptual monstrosity, quote, expert consensus, which is a perfect example of what I'm referencing here. Citing such expert consensus is the perfect avenue to act without consequences and personal responsibility, which is precisely why we're hearing the term all around us as of late. While a dictator or strongman might step forward and clearly state an idea or opinion before then foisting it upon the public, weaker men tend to band together to avoid putting their necks on the line, with an understanding that they'll then circle the wagons as a collective unit if attacked. It's an incredibly effective preservation strategy. And I say weak here because it's certainly an accurate and important descriptor, but there is a far better one. They're also bot men. This doesn't mean a Soros or Schiff or Rothschild approaches these men with a suitcase full of cash. Nothing in our world actually transpires like this. They've become masters at getting things done behind fronts, screens, and without personal risk. And they've spent decades creating the corporate and legal architecture necessary to do so. When I speak of bot men, a term I hope we'll all use more often in the near future because it's spot on and all important, I'm referring to all those individuals directly or indirectly bribed or cajoled or threatened or incentivized, even if this just means they're choosing to take the path of profit or of least resistance, instead of walking the path they know deep down to be the ultimately just, right, or healthy. This problem is endemic because money ultimately runs our world, because most people are willing to do just about anything for it, and because its tendrils now run through and increasingly dominate every last sphere, whether it be politics, entertainment and popular culture, science and academia, protest and, quote, social justice, etc. Virtually nothing is immune from its all-pervasive effects. Even some dissident right-thinkers have been affected, receiving money from Jeffrey Epstein himself in a few cases. The beauty of these arrangements for both parties involved is that it can never be proven, conclusively and beyond any shadow of a doubt, that receiving money from these hidden hands and powerful forces behind the scenes directly translates into a person altering their message accordingly. It's impossible to look into their heart or soul. So if they claim, "These are my own opinions, in no way shaped by X or Y donors," it's impossible to state with 100% certainty that they're being dishonest. Even if the ideological thrust of the academic grants or research papers, archaeological digs, or political opinion pieces all happen to push public opinion in a relatively singular direction, all involved at every layer in this process can still pretend they're part of some naturally formed and organically operating structure that seeks truth or the betterment of our lives. In other words, money now shapes virtually everything from the ground up, behind layers of masks and fronts and proxies, represented by the parasitic administrative class of bot men. A simple way to understand these machinations and this machine at large is this. We have an extremely small subset of hidden hands possessing much of the world's wealth, who found a structure by which they might directly and indirectly employ a fleet of thousands of pliable careerists and compromised yes-men to slowly but surely lay the foundations for the vision of the future they prefer. Additionally, and what makes this structure all the more powerful and flexible, this administrative class, these hirelings and errand boys reading scripts and following orders handed down from on high, can be freely rotated in and out with ease. without jeopardizing any of the progress towards the larger aims. If a fellow traveler in this group happens to be caught red-handed in a scandal the complicit media can't help them escape or sidestep, they're often quietly shuffled into a less public role, still obscenely profitable, just less visible. An entire ecosystem of advisors and consultants and similarly unnecessary occupations has thus developed over the years. So there's always a safety net for all of these bought men who show unswerving loyalty. The Green New Deal, the Great Reset, Build Back Better, these are examples of some of their current means and methods. Organizations like the CDC and the WHO epitomize the unelected bureaucratic, self-titled expert class that really do intend to dominate your future. Again, it's important to find the right visualization framework to best and most clearly understand what's happening here. These people and this culture adore the top-heavy Chinese model, in which a small ruling caste might slowly but surely separate themselves from the public at large and solidify themselves as unquestioned rulers. My problem with this future isn't simply with its enthusiastic decimation of the middle class, of liberty and the ability of each individual to think and speak and live in a manner he feels best, but perhaps just as importantly, I object to this future because I've seen firsthand the caliber of individual involved in this push for ultimate power. What they're creating is the very definition of a kakistocracy. The common shared factor among this self-selected subset, the tie that binds, isn't a sharp mind or a history of judgment and calling things correctly, or any type of merit as we've always defined this term. The commonality and shared trait seems to be that they're pliable, compromisable, either naive and ignorant to the forces at play, or simply uncaring, just seeking a pleasant and easy life, regardless of the costs to the world at large. One could even go so far as to say that the common factor isn't strength, as has always been the traditional aim and goal of every nation with regard to their leaders, but rather weakness. It's a complete inversion. And I even get the feeling that many of these mediocre men know this on some level, and are driven in part by an envy and bitterness that they don't fully understand and haven't bothered to grapple with or process and work through. There's a malicious glee in the eyes of these subversives in many cases. It's undeniable. And here's why all good people must take a stand in the coming months and years, and must find the courage and spirit to aggressively resist this push on all fronts. I started this video with some thoughts on why this point in time is different, on why this push for ultimate power is different than any we've seen in history. It's different because it is global. Should they succeed in their aims, there will be no refuge, no escape, no safe haven or place to hide, no alternatives. What they're engaging in is objectively evil and unjust for this simple reason. They seek to forcibly impose. They hide behind flowery and positive wording, behind the pretense that they're fighting for rights or representation of various minority groups. In truth, they're using these minority groups as a weapon to crumble the old order, and in fact to crumble order itself. There are organizations devoted entirely towards facilitating the mass importation of millions of human beings from places like Haiti, Somalia, Afghanistan, and South America, not just into the United States, but then equally distributed across every region to ensure their weapon has total, all-pervasive reach. And perhaps to make sure there's no untouched corner of the world able to maintain health and happiness and a high standard of living, which would then stand as an open rebuke and begin to cause people to clearly recognize all we've lost and all we stand to lose. Ideally, I think people should live in the manner they prefer to the greatest extent possible. I might personally disagree with a culture that turns a criminal who died of a fentanyl overdose into a saint or messiah, or a culture that denies the most fundamental truths of natural biology, or declares war on millennia of traditional wisdom in favor of some theories cooked up by a handful of psychologically unwell men a few decades ago. I might disagree or even be revolted by any number of the manners in which they might choose to live, but I'd fully respect their right to do so. What I can't respect, what none of us should ever respect, and in fact should stand completely firm in our fight against, is their imposition of these ideas and perspectives on the rest of the world. Nobody has that right. And those who have tried to go this route of forcible imposition in the past have been met with violent resistance, and justifiably so. Had they not been met with such resistance, our world would have devolved into a much more dark, bleak, and desolate place far earlier. We owe a great deal to our ancestors in this regard. They weren't cowards, and historically, recognized this sickness and poison for what it was. They were watchful, alert. They stood guard. It's about time we followed their lead in this respect. Again, I want to reiterate, because the subversives on the other side of the fence have created the most absurd caricature of who we are and what we seek. Very few of us want to dominate other peoples and impose our way of life upon them. This grotesque notion, still entertained by many of the boomer generation, so deeply conditioned by World War II mythos and propaganda, that those on the far right or in nationalist circles seek violence and genocide and enslavement of others, couldn't be more far off the mark. And while these propagandists have encouraged that gullible portion of the population to look at the far right with suspicious eyes, believing an outbreak of these things might occur at any moment, the rootless, cosmopolitan, Bolshevik-friendly left is now beginning to encourage open violence, to speak proudly about wanting to decimate a race and culture and replace it with another, to create wage slaves of the unfortunate salt-of-the-earth lower middle class who are being bled dry from every angle. And they couldn't be more open at this point about their authoritarian aims and goals. This may still be an unpopular view in some circles, but I tend to think these circles are shrinking as this idea becomes ever harder to deny. And the idea is this. International finance and banking represents the true victors post-World War II. General Patton recognized this, Kennedy recognized this, even Eisenhower, very much a puppeted man in so many ways, eventually attempted to sound the alarm about the hidden hands behind the scenes that had become practically all-powerful in his day. Virtually nothing was done. And since, this culture has had decades to further entrench themselves and their power base, and prepare for any challenges and threats. Decades to absolutely master the art of persuasion, indoctrination, and various types and degrees of mind control. Decades to install a mockingbird press, posing as several supposedly different and distinct institutions, yet who ultimately represent only one. And now, with the advent of the internet as we know it, essentially the printing press on steroids, they've had decades to put to use all of their knowledge and tools in ways so powerful, yet subtle, that there's hardly a man alive capable of comprehending the full nature and scope of what's being accomplished. Compartmentalization ensures this. We have many individual whistleblowers attempting to sound the alarm on this or that specific front of this larger battle, so often horrified by the abuses and overreach and brazen deceit they've witnessed personally. But imagine for a moment that all of these facets are connected, part of a single massive machine. The horror or anger or disgust expressed by these individual whistleblowers would likely be magnified 100-fold if they could see beyond their narrow lane and glimpse the totality of the effort being engaged in here. More and more often, I'm encountering even middle-of-the-road moderate types who, after poring over the hard data on all things related to this mystery virus, fully admit something deeply strange is going on here, but unable to know exactly why or exactly what forces or institutions or individuals are behind it all. The confusion is understandable, because the entire dynamic created by this virus checks a number of boxes simultaneously. Yes, it certainly benefits China significantly. Yes, it benefits the loathsome corporate oligarchs and technocrats who've watched their bottom line shoot through the roof as small and medium-sized businesses and the American middle class are pushed to near extinction, and our economic structure is irrevocably changed forever. Yes, it benefits that mediocre class of administrators and deep state lackeys, a quote expert class, and a slew of their domestic and international organizations, coincidentally all led by individuals with similar political and ideological leanings. Yes, of course it benefits one of the two political parties, but even more so the establishment class of both parties. Yes, it finally creates a clear line of demarcation between those willing to comply and submit and those who still have some fire in them, and that primal mode of physical and psychological health that innately resists all bonds, constraints, and fetters, especially those created by men they've been given no reason to trust or respect. Yes, it's a huge step in erasing borders and divisions between nations, and sets the stage for international action, international organizations, and various globalist dream scenarios. Yes, it seems to massively lower fertility, produce windfall profits for big pharma. It helps create and solidify a governing administrative caste to be used as dutiful and replaceable minions in the future. It does all of these things and quite a bit more simultaneously. It almost seems an inefficient use of time and brain power to attempt to determine which of these is the leading factor, or who is most to blame. We're witnessing an alliance of forces that all have a great deal to gain, in a dystopian world in which freedom, independence, and individual sovereignty cease to be. And it's likely this alliance ultimately represents a relatively singular force in action, existing and operating above and beyond traditional governments and intra-nation economic structures. As important as it is to eventually sort out the specific questions of who and why with perfect clarity, it's far more important to devote time and energy to finding the best ways to prevent them from winning the day here. And not just throw wrenches into their wheels, but eventually derail the entire train. I continue to be amazed at that small fraction of the dissident right still not viewing this as a leading issue. Ignored, it stands to cost us everything. When the ranks of military, media, celebrity, and popular culture and the corporate world are purged of the principled, courageous, or free thinking, the power they'll then hold will be total and unchecked, and in fact uncheckable. They might shut down your bank account, get you fired from your job, prevent your travel, cause you to lose custody battles, fine you, and all of this while showering the compliant around you with rewards and incentives. It's incredible that there's any doubt left in any reasonable person's mind. This is the power move so many of us have been expecting might come. This is the end-stage plan being set in motion. Does anyone think it's unrelated or purely coincidental that nearly all of those pushing open borders, critical race theory, the destruction of statues and all other vestiges of Western accomplishment and heritage, the idolization and deification of individuals like George Floyd or groups like the LGBTQ community, are almost without exception collected together on one side of this push? This is a culture at work, and what they're engaging in is a hostile cultural takeover and cultural imposition. There's simply no denying this anymore. At this stage, it should be transparently obvious to anyone that bothers to give these happenings any serious consideration. This may not be the fight we expected or wanted, but it's the determinative fight that now stands to dictate our collective future across all Western nations, as it so clearly opens the door to total power and dominance for this corrupt culture. And it's one we can't simply sit on our hands and lose. So what is it we can do? We might feel the noose tightening and see all of these elements coming together, But it's incredibly easy to feel overwhelmed and feel as if they simply control all of the pieces on the board and that there is no way out. It's understandable that many might feel this way, and in fact, this is the point of view those pushing us into this globalist serfdom would love to see adopted, one of hopelessness, powerlessness, pessimism, and despair. But here's why it's not accurate, not correct or justified. The individuals spearheading this rapid shift represent an extremely small percentage of the overall population. Like a bullfrog that puffs itself up to appear far larger, they're able to greatly magnify themselves with the help of print and television and social media, and still further by taking advantage of weakness, greed, and the self-serving mentality they've so effectively drummed into such a great many. But they're still a very, very small subset of the population. Never forget this. And those bought men willing to play their game would shift allegiance overnight, as their human type has always done since the dawn of recorded history, if we were someday able to find some way to shift this carrot and stick incentivization and punishment framework. It's best to think of this type of person as, if you'll forgive some blunt speech, whores and prostitutes. Not in the purely sexual sense of that word, of course, but broadly speaking. They don't have many deeply held opinions or guiding principles, they don't think much or deeply, and their lives often consist of a series of basic sensory stimuli followed by their conditioned reactions to said stimuli. And their life philosophy tends to be shaped according to a superficial cost-benefit analysis at every turn in life, as they aim, in each case, to take the easiest or most profitable path. So, we need to learn to develop some carrots and sticks. There needs to be a cost involved for selling out one's most basic ethical principles, or their nation or culture, and some incentives or rewards or figurative pats on the back for acting in a more noble manner. Of course, the world of money, broadly speaking, is almost completely lost. And this will only get far worse in the coming years, as this machine finds ever more creative ways to destroy those who won't submit. But there are many carrots and sticks lying outside the world of money. And even within this world, we still have options. Crypto is certainly one. Additionally, we saw recently as a few airlines refused to comply, due to courageous pilots and a mass of deeply angry customers. The Oklahoma National Guard has taken an extremely impressive stand. Members of teachers' unions and school boards, who until recently could just phone in their work and collect their paychecks, as they did whatever their handlers or union bosses told them to do, are finally starting to recognize that they can't simply expose kids to anti-white race hatred and pornography and pedophile-friendly literature without a cost. And now we're seeing scores of states officially breaking ties with the National School Board Association. Over recent decades, the left has created something of an art of loud and vocal and annoying protest. They've become experts at being the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, in part because they have all the money in the world covertly backing these operations. But I'd argue it's far more powerful when, for example, a parent who genuinely feels deeply about a given issue is able to stand and give clear and eloquent voice to their heart and mind. I hope we might all start giving some real thought to how each of us, as individuals, might begin to flex our muscle a bit more and more often, and find ways to become a punishing and rewarding force ourselves. Reaching out to communicate with those who have made positive choices, especially courageous choices, selflessly and in the face of backlash, is just as important as standing against those making destructive choices. And in fact, in conditions like these where it's so easy to become disgusted and angry, it seems incredibly important to try to find a balance here, in part for the sake of our own psychological well-being. To not simply be against the dark or self-serving parasitic forces, but to actively embrace their opposites. There's something healthy and gratifying and life-affirming on an almost primal level about genuinely feeling and expressing thanks and gratitude, and finding positive common ground and mutual resonance with another human being. In other words, don't just fight your enemies, but seek to embrace your allies in equal measure. They may be a motley sort at present, a mixed bag, and we're certainly not going to agree on everything, but it'd be difficult to stress enough the importance of this one fight. If this noose is allowed to close and constrict, every other battle we might wish to fight, domestically or internationally, essentially becomes an almost impossible uphill battle. If they're able to create this framework of organizations and institutions across the world, which can then act in lockstep in an allied and interconnected way, completely crushing dissent would then be child's play. Anyone standing up to this encroachment is my ally at the moment, full stop. The specifics of where we might respectively head and how we might shape our world when the dust settles is an important discussion, but perhaps a discussion for a later time. What matters right this moment is finding ways to meaningfully counter this incredibly powerful, well-organized, and well-funded force that seeks to stamp us out and impose its will. We can discuss details and minutiae as soon as we're standing on the grave of its corpse. I spoke of the need to become forces of punishment and incentive whenever and wherever we're able, but realistically will not be the leading players in this arena, at least not anytime soon. Money will run this show for the most part. We can have a very real effect, but not a dominant one. And I think we should all be completely frank and honest about where this domination of the world of money will almost certainly lead in the near future. Their goal is to shut us out, to become the only game in town and position themselves as gatekeeper controlling access. I think most of you listening likely recognize this, or at least suspect its potentiality. They know full well that if they're able to create fear and trepidation with regard to how you're going to keep your job, or pay your bills, or make use of air travel or public transportation, or even just go to the grocery store and put food on your table, they can then make a person do just about anything. What we need to do, and do quickly, is find means and methods to work around them, to the extent that their threats and incentives have less and less power accordingly. Roger Scruton correctly labeled this class of middlemen parasites, a fairly harsh and jarring term to ears accustomed to excessively civil discourse, but also completely appropriate here. This subset of the population that, broadly speaking, creates and produces nothing, yet always finds clever paths to take and tax and subvert and control. They're not our farmers or construction workers or truck drivers, our engineers or leading STEM graduates, even our greatest intellectual or scientific pioneers or inventors. Rather, they're a group of people, often with overly narrow and increasingly unnecessary skill sets, who tend to live off of the hard work and creativity of others. The goal needs to be to restructure and reorganize our own world in order to shut them out, to ensure the products of our time and energy and collective effort aren't indirectly funneled into their hands, and to be able to work and deal with one another directly. Remove the parasite from the host, and it will, inevitably, starve. I mentioned how silly it seemed, in a sense, for us to worry and fret about being locked out of the system, when the productive class represent the only ones creating real value for the system. In other words, the problems we face are only logistical and structural in nature, and if we're able to find a way to alter this structure, perhaps even reviving trade and barter systems, among other ideas, it becomes impossible for any of their actions to gain real purchase in disrupting our lives. For example, farmers across the nation have been ordered to dump or destroy their crop harvests, as well as milk, eggs, pigs, and cattle, simply wasting massive amounts. And all of this as our food prices continue to skyrocket. This is just one of the many examples of an absurd inefficiency in the marketplace. If we developed some basic means of hooking up those who provide such necessary products and services directly with the public who will soon so desperately need them, this, for example, would represent one serious step in the right direction, and would help prevent the artificial manipulation of our food supply via dishonest political actors. One of the ideas I think has tremendous promise that I encourage you all to look into is a concept popular in the Nordic nations called Reiko rings. Essentially, it's a means of hooking up the producers of food with the customers seeking food, while cutting out all middlemen or grocery stores and their related costs and hassles. The focus is on organic and ethically produced, completely fresh and pesticide and chemical-free fruits, vegetables, meats, chickens, eggs, and dairy. The difference between a Reiko ring setup and a farmer's market is that the food producers only bring already purchased foods to a given location, which means they don't need to stand around in stalls and potentially throw out unsold products at the end of the day. The customer places an order for everything he'd like to obtain and then simply picks it up at a Reiko location. If you happen to have experience in this realm and ideas to share, please consider doing so in the comments of this video, or join us in our Phoenix Project chat community. I'd love to see solutions like this attain a much wider adoption and even act as employment opportunities, ideally, for those in search of work, and specifically those who'd prefer to work in a capacity they find fulfilling or consider especially helpful or worthwhile. I think it'd be an extremely positive step for all of those tired of working unfulfilling jobs for corporate entities we don't resonate with or respect, to find ways to earn a living producing real value again, in the realm of food production specifically, for several reasons, not the least of which would be that in the case of economic or supply chain collapse, which seems right around the corner as we speak, we'll be in a much better position to navigate the fallout. And as a broader community, will be much more immune to threats and pressures from governments and allied corporate and multinational interests. I strongly recommend learning to grow some food crops, even on the smallest experimental scale to start. These skill sets and this knowledge may be invaluable soon. And this applies across the board. This is the theme of this video, and a core concept that bears repeating over and over and over. Our goal should be to slowly but surely return to the fundamentals in all aspects of life, but especially with regard to our occupations and where we're devoting our time and energy. Producing and creating real value, cutting out middlemen and eliminating gatekeeping forces, maximizing independence and self-sufficiency or community sufficiency, and minimizing dependence on this globalist economic machine and all of its various tendrils and offshoots. I've spoken in the past about getting to know your local sheriffs and the power of a short note or brief call establishing a relationship and letting them know you appreciate anything they're willing to do to ensure that power remains in the hands of the people. But I strongly recommend considering getting to know your local farmers and, where possible, finding ways to purchase from them directly. I've done this in Washington State, and there's something to be said for a direct source of things like fresh eggs and grass-fed beef and raw milk, and knowing exactly what you're getting, who you're getting it from, and being able to directly support local farmers and ranchers. But of course, food production is only one aspect of what I'm speaking to here. I'd like to see us work together and find creative ways to cover all of our bases, meaning give some concerted thought to each and every way they might attempt to shut us out of the economic system to force compliance, and engage in equally concerted thought and discussion about how we might sidestep these traps. If they attempt to demand injections for anyone that seeks an Uber or Lyft ride, for example, is it out of the realm of possibility in the age of social media to create an alternative service? Not necessarily some sprawling corporate entity, but a very lightweight and scrappy solution in which people and willing drivers are directly hooked up in a more informal way. Again, sidestepping middleman fees and similar nonsense. Or if major airlines attempt to go the same route and demand injections for all travelers, might it be possible for smaller chartered flight services to step in, slowly but surely? In some arenas, the logistical hurdles will be bigger than in others, certainly. But ultimately, where there's a will, there's a way. And the first step is to start thinking of and actively discussing all manners of solutions and workarounds. Not just a "we will not comply" attitude towards this criminally corrupt overreach of this government, corporate, big pharma, and intelligence agency alliance, but working to get to a stage where we have no need or desire to comply, breaking their monopolistic control, especially with regard to all basics and necessities of life. There's even the specter of starvation-level food shortages in bigger cities if things were to truly collapse. And simultaneous with these food shortages and price hikes, we have thousands of good people looking for meaningful work. Consider this as one of the many hypothetical solutions. Picture, for a moment, creating a fund in which 100% of the donations went directly into cost-efficient land purchases, land that was then portioned out to men willing to work it, with an agreement to pay back the generosity over time with their resulting food production. The more successful of whom might choose to donate additional proceeds to the fund above and beyond what was initially owed, and thus allow it to obtain more land and expand its footprint ever more. And consider that there are still many good people with sizable fortunes, with an upright character and a more traditional sense of ethics and values. Considering that investors routinely pump millions into dubious and risky tech startups, is it really impossible to envision finding the occasional generous individual willing to take a chance and make significant investments in such conceptions, assuming they were well thought out, planned, and structured? And when I mention big ideas like these, please know I'm well aware there are hurdles and obstacles and complications and difficulties to sort out. But nobody can tell me such ideas are impossibilities. They're absolutely not. Again, it really is true that wherever there's a will, there's a way. Where there's enough will, a way will inevitably be found. Again, this is just one random example, chosen to give some idea of the types of discussions I'd like to see us start engaging in. New leaders and organizers need to emerge to help shape and orient new solutions. When you see somebody with a good idea and a good head on their shoulders, and the energy and inspiration to see it through and carry it to fruition, support that person, get behind them. And if you're willing and able, consider playing some active role. Even just engaging in discussion and constructive debate on these topics is extremely worthwhile at the moment, and it's the type of thing that's a necessary prerequisite for all that might follow later. The larger battle over the coming years really will be a fight between money and spirit, in a sense. And what I mean here is that those most responsible for pushing this new agenda have a virtually endless supply of capital at their disposal. From the Federal Reserve and central banks at the peak of this power pyramid that literally print our fiat currencies as they please, to the multinationals and corporate interests who are such direct beneficiaries, to that wealth of NGOs and activist organizations. All institutions or individuals that can be motivated exclusively by financial gain are currently allies or will soon become allies of this disgusting, soulless machine. On the other side of this hypothetical battlefield would be all those motivated by higher aims, whether this be a belief in God, or a deep and abiding love for one's family or children, or their people or culture or nation. Higher aims that impart their thought and action with a positive and healthy spirit, and a desire to do good and be just in the highest senses of those words. Remember that this moment in time represents an obstacle and challenge, and a crossroads, and two possible futures await. Either we'll find ourselves waiting in line for the 30th iteration of some Marvel movie, surrounded by kids with soulless eyes making vapid TikTok videos, having to display some iPhone app to show proof of our monthly booster shot, only to walk home through a concrete jungle littered with feces and needles and vagrants, to a small apartment to eat our nightly ration of bug slurry, to dread waking in the morning to drag ourselves to some 9 to 5 at a company we despise and have no personal stake in, as we slowly become ever more drained, disillusioned, and spiritually exhausted. Or we take an absolutely rigid and resolute stand, whenever and wherever possible, refuse to give another inch, and prepare ourselves, mind, body, and soul, for the inevitable fallout and collapse, carefully and thoughtfully constructing visions of how we might then someday rebuild, to usher in a mode of being vastly superior to the present in every conceivable way. To summarize this concept in a single sentence, we need to find ways to minimize our dependence on those that despise us and increase our involvement and interconnection with those of like mind on every front. They've cleverly monopolized a great many of the levers of power and influence and shut the door behind them. We can bang on those doors until we're blue in the face, or beg and plead for them to be reasonable, or compromise ourselves and make deals as the noose tightens. Or we can create new doors, new levers of power, new machinery. Nearly everyone can play some part in creating this parallel machinery, whether it be with ideas, with money, with organization or leadership, or through the engaging of certain relevant skill sets. I encourage everyone listening who is willing to play some role in all of this to, as a first step, join the discussion. There's a great benefit to this being fairly decentralized, and I think the ideal here might be the fostering of several small-scale solutions that gradually come together to form larger solutions. Many are, quote, black-pilled because they see a coming collapse and no remaining avenues to sidestep it. I'd argue this might equally be viewed as the greatest white pill. Much needs to collapse. We've allowed ourselves to be surrounded by structures and scaffolding and architecture that needs to be obliterated utterly to allow something better to take shape. Don't simply look at the coming collapse and feel despair as a result. Look past this collapse at possibilities and rebirth. Our role seems less to stand in front of this train and prevent the collapse than to ensure that we're in a position to best pick up the pieces and rise from the ruins to recreate something valuable and lasting. I speak about history often and attempt to bring to the fore what I believe are its most important lessons. One that stands out, especially right this moment, is the immense and central importance of liberty and independence, which can easily be traced all the way back to the Scythians on horseback on the open plains, a trait which would then manifest itself throughout all Western peoples. Historically, there wasn't merely a right to bear arms, but a duty. Earning one's weapon was a rite of passage as a man, and was an outward signal to the world that you were worthy of the power a weapon bestows. This sword was then a constant companion during every trip or voyage, at every major folk meeting at which pressing matters were discussed, kept by their sides throughout banquets and feasts and every manner of social occasion, and not merely because it was somehow necessary for personal protection, as there seems to have been almost none of that type of indiscriminate crime we experience today, but because it was a symbolic representation to themselves and all looking on of their independence and sovereignty. One of the defining elements of the culture of that sprawling Germanic people group, whether it be those Goths in Spain or northern Italy, or the Franks in France, or the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, or the Vikings in Scandinavia, was that each and every man, as an individual, was meant to be a force to be reckoned with. This was the greatest possible insurance policy against the tyranny of lesser men. To be submissive, subservient, a cog in the machine, and most especially a foreign machine or one they didn't believe in or resonate with, was a type of life viewed with disgust and suspicion. and not from mere pride, but because they seem to know where such behavior ultimately led. If you're in the habit of handing over your power and bending the knee to any that demand it, you'll be inviting and opening the door to all manners of horrors and injustices, and not just within your own lifetime, but also across the lifetimes of all future generations. They knew, and even voiced this on more than one occasion, that if they allowed themselves to be disarmed and subjugated, or gave themselves over to a domesticated softness and materialism, they'd be acting as cowardly and irresponsible stewards of their inheritance. Owning some means of self-defense is only a narrow aspect of what I'm trying to reference here. The larger point is that these men were instructed by far healthier traditions and mentalities, and thus saw clearly the dangers of ceasing to be vigilant, of outsourcing control over themselves or their families. They forever remained armed, competent, and awake. This is the mindset we need to find ways to embrace again, because the types of people that conspire for ultimate power in this world are never its best elements, to put it mildly, and will succeed if they're not capable of being checked. I like the Scythian example because nearly all listening are of this indirect lineage to varying degrees. From the US to Canada, Europe to Russia, even you Aussies. And I mention this because this fight we're facing is now very much an international one. In a very real sense, we're all in this together. If a globalized, unipolar world begins to take the shape our opponents would prefer it take in the coming decades, the end result would be something dark beyond measure. And the evidence for this is all around us. It's become very clear which direction they'd prefer to take us. The unique powers that technology might grant this ruling class are beyond the imagination of even the most creative. The next few years are so crucial largely for this reason. Once a certain threshold is crossed, once a certain level of power and control is achieved, it'll then become all but impossible to prevent a total and absolute monopolization of all levers of international power without immense bloodshed. There's a reason so much money and effort has been devoted to our deracination and atomization. A reason why the average man on the street is now so historically illiterate. History is a series of cycles and patterns, of warring archetypal forces and ideas. The less a man understands these, the less firmly rooted he is, the more he loses his sense of direction and his innate sense of true north, making him far easier to shape, mold, and ultimately control. And those who've dug deeply down these paths understand the level of conscious and willful orchestration behind these efforts. In other words, though they may be surrounded by an army of useful idiots and naive and overly trusting dupes, the true power brokers and shot callers at the heart of this push to reshape the world are conscious deceivers, the false shepherds that can't enter the sheepfold through the front door, and, like thieves and robbers, attempt to slip in undetected through another route. Their magic is powerful and will grow more so, and a great many will capitulate, give in to the siren song, and allow themselves to be drawn into this artificial black box creation, falling ever further away from God's light, further away from nature and the natural order and fundamental laws that govern all things, and further away from spirit. We are living through the Great Cheapening, a materialist and reductionist science, arrogant beyond belief, that pretends to understand the workings of the universe merely because it's able to measure or chart or label the effects of the cause, and finally denying even the existence of the cause, the creator and motive force and unmoved mover. We take a wide-eyed child filled with wonder and awe at the mystery and magic of the universe, and subsequently turn them into dead-eyed nihilists, completely oblivious to the profound beauty all around them. and even mistaking this supposed triumph over this abiding sense of wonder and awe and mystery as the mark of an educated mind or refined intellect. We mistake pretentious overconfidence for knowledge and understanding, and elevate the most arrogant and least wise men to positions of incredible power and influence. And thus everywhere, we're attempting to transgress the blueprint of our Creator and follow countless artificial paths of our own making, not realizing that the further we stray from this light, the more we'll be fumbling around like fools in the darkness. We are men playing God, and playing the role badly, and can't help but do so because it's a role we're not meant to play. Our greatest men are our greatest men because they recognized God, and can then strive to think and act and create accordingly. And in doing so, can become conduits in their highest moments, through whom divine genius might flow. Because all truly great creative genius flows from above. And those that lack this connection, who attempt to emulate or conjure up creative genius without recognizing or emulating the Creator and His blueprint, can only produce abominations as a result. A world cobbled together by men who lack this divine guidance would be a dark, confused chaos, a hell on earth. And I mean this literally. And thus we're becoming a world increasingly filled with abominations and monstrous ugliness, churned out by bad builders and charlatan architects. When someone like Dostoevsky tells us beauty will save the world, he's not simply referring to pretty pictures and pleasant aesthetics. We can speak of the words of a great poet as beautiful, or the graceful movement of a trained dancer, or a noble and dignified bearing, or an especially heroic and courageous act. By beauty, he's referring to all of the above, to the perfect and all-pervasive artistic imprint of the Creator, and recognizing that only insofar as we're able to comprehend this imprint and proceed to think and live and create accordingly, will we begin to reproduce and regenerate life-affirming, spirit-edifying, redemptive beauty. The choice really is ours. We can continue to work as hired contractors, building up and patching this ugly and crumbling edifice, ironically helping create a structure we'll be increasingly locked out of, unless we acquiesce to every current and future demand of those forces funding its construction. Or we can take a step back, take stock of lessons learned from past failures and missteps, and slowly but surely rediscover our footing and begin to envision and create something new. Who knows what might come of it? Let's find out.